Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. In the weeks after the election of 1876, the United States quietly prepared for a possibility it had sworn never to face again. Federal troops were positioned in Washington. Political leaders spoke in private about militias. Newspapers warned of rival inaugurations. The country was not at war, but it was no longer certain that peace would hold. The danger was not imaginary. Two men could plausibly claim the presidency, each supported by different legal arguments and different institutions. If both claims were pressed, there was no clear authority capable of stopping what followed. The Constitution offered procedures for elections, but it offered no solution for an election that produced two incompatible answers. What made the moment especially volatile was how little separated law from force. If one candidate were sworn in and the other refused to accept it, legitimacy itself would fracture. In a nation barely a decade removed from civil war, that fracture was not theoretical. It had precedent. This was not a crisis driven by crowds in the streets or radical movements at the margins. It unfolded among lawyers, legislators, governors, and judges. The mechanisms of government were still functioning, but they were pulling in different directions. Order existed, but it was no longer coherent. Only after this danger became visible did the public begin to understand what had happened on Election Day. The election itself had not ended in chaos. It had ended in ambiguity. And in 1876, ambiguity was enough to reopen questions the country believed had been settled by force 11 years earlier. On the surface, the results seemed clear. Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic governor of New York, had won the popular vote. Early counts suggested he had also secured a majority of electoral votes. For a brief moment, many Americans believed the contest was over. Then the certainty dissolved. Reports from several southern states arrived late, incomplete, and contested. Republican officials challenged Democratic claims, citing irregularities and unresolved returns. What had looked like a finished election began to look provisional, then unstable, and finally dangerous. The crisis did not begin with violence. It began with a result that could not be finalized and a system that did not know how to force an ending. By the time Americans realized how close the country had come to another civil war, the mechanisms that usually guaranteed a peaceful outcome were already under strain. The danger exposed by the election cannot be understood without acknowledging how unfinished the Civil War truly was. In 1876, the war had ended on paper, but it had not concluded in practice. Its political and emotional consequences still shaped how Americans interpreted conflict, authority, and compromise. The Union had preserved the nation by force, but the terms of reunion were imposed rather than mutually accepted. Former Confederate states returned under conditions set in Washington, not negotiated among equals. For many white Southerners, this reality produced compliance without consent. They participated in the system because they had to, not because they believed in it. Resentment lingered openly. Federal authority in the South was associated with military occupation, political displacement, and social upheaval. The Republican Party, which had led the war and dominated Reconstruction, came to symbolize all three. Its legitimacy in much of the region rested on enforcement rather than acceptance. In the North, the war left a different legacy. Union victory had come at extraordinary cost, and the idea of renewed conflict was deeply unsettling. Yet Northern voters also doubted whether the South had truly accepted the new order. Suspicion replaced solidarity. The war had ended, but trust had not been restored. This mutual distrust transformed elections into existential tests. Losing an election did not simply mean losing office. It raised questions about whether the post-war settlement would endure at all. Every transfer of power became a referendum on the future of the Union itself. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction had failed to produce consensus. It functioned through law and force, but not through shared belief. Its survival depended almost entirely on continued Republican control of the federal government. That dependence made national elections unusually dangerous. The election of 1876, therefore, carried meaning far beyond the candidates. For Republicans, it threatened the collapse of the post-war order they had constructed. For Democrats, especially in the South, it offered a chance to reclaim political autonomy and end what they viewed as imposed rule. Both sides understood the stakes, and neither believed the other would act neutrally if given the chance. This context explains why shifting vote totals produced fear rather than patience. The anxiety was not about delay. It was about what delay implied. When Americans spoke of civil war in 1876, they were not invoking history. They were recognizing how little had changed since the last one ended. The mechanism designed to manage this unresolved conflict was Reconstruction, a system that shaped Southern political life for more than a decade after the war. In theory, Reconstruction was meant to rebuild the Union on new foundations extending citizenship and equal protection to those who had been enslaved. In practice, it functioned far more as an apparatus of control than a process of reconciliation. After 1865, the former Confederate states were not simply welcomed back into the Union. They were placed under military oversight divided into districts governed by Union authorities. Federal troops supervised elections, enforced new laws, and intervened when local governments resisted. This arrangement was effective in imposing compliance, but it did little to foster legitimacy. The legal centerpiece of Reconstruction was the 14th Amendment. It redefined citizenship and promised equal protection under the law. Ratifying it was a condition for readmission, not an outcome of persuasion. Southern legislatures accepted the amendment because refusal meant continued exclusion, not because its principles had been embraced. Once readmitted, many state governments moved quickly to reclaim as much autonomy as possible. They complied formally with federal requirements while searching for ways to limit their impact. The federal government retained authority, but its reach depended on constant enforcement. Cooperation was the exception, not the rule. This dynamic produced a political order that was inherently unstable. Republican governments in the South relied on federal backing and fragile coalitions. Their power rested on law and presence rather than broad local support. Democratic opposition, meanwhile, framed itself as resistance to an imposed system rather than opposition within a shared one. Reconstruction therefore postponed rather than resolved the struggle over who governed the South. Each election became a test of whether federal authority would be sustained or withdrawn. Violence, intimidation, and procedural maneuvering were not anomalies. They were tools used to reshape power without openly challenging federal law. By the mid-1870s, national patience with this arrangement was wearing thin. Northern voters grew weary of enforcement scandal and economic strain. Support for an open-ended military presence declined. Reconstruction survived, but only barely. That erosion mattered profoundly in 1876. A system maintained by power rather than consent could not absorb uncertainty. When the election failed to produce a clear outcome, the underlying fragility of Reconstruction was exposed. The crisis was not an accident. It was built into the structure of the peace. The instability of Reconstruction was most visible in the gap between formal rights and lived reality. Constitutional amendments promised equality, but state governments learned how to hollow out those promises without openly defying federal law. This distinction mattered because it shaped how power was exercised and how responsibility was avoided. Once Southern states were readmitted, legislatures moved quickly to regain control over elections and governance. Voting rules were rewritten around property ownership literacy and registration procedures that appeared neutral but were anything but. These measures were not framed as racial exclusions. They were framed as standards technically lawful and therefore difficult to challenge. At the same time, intimidation filled the space law could not reach. Violence at polling places, threats against political organizers, and selective enforcement of the law became common features of elections. These acts were often carried out by local groups rather than officials, allowing state governments to deny direct involvement while benefiting from the results. Federal enforcement existed, but it was uneven and increasingly cautious. Proving intent was difficult. Intervening required political will that was steadily declining. Rights remained intact in theory, but their protection depended on a federal presence that many voters no longer wanted to sustain. For Republicans, this erosion represented a quiet reversal of the war's outcome. Emancipation had been secured, but political equality was slipping away through mechanisms that were formally legal. For Democrats, especially in the South, these developments were framed as the restoration of order and local self-government after years of disruption. By the time of the 1876 election, this conflict had become routine. Elections in several Southern states were conducted with the expectation that results would be disputed. Both parties entered the process, anticipating fraud, suppression, or manipulation by the other. Trust was not absent. It had been replaced. This environment made the election uniquely volatile. in states where margins were narrow and legitimacy already questioned even small irregularities carried national consequences. When these states later became the center of the presidential dispute, they did so against a backdrop of years of contested authority. The struggle over rights and enforcement meant that losing an election was not simply a political setback. It threatened the survival of entire systems of power. Under those conditions, uncertainty was not tolerable. It was dangerous. By the time voters went to the polls in 1876, the Republican Party was no longer operating from a position of confidence. It had governed the country since the Civil War, overseen Reconstruction, and expanded federal authority in ways that had once seemed necessary. But long control had produced fatigue, and fatigue had begun to erode legitimacy. The presidency of Ulysses S. Grant embodied this problem. Grant's personal reputation as a war hero remained largely intact, yet his administration was associated with corruption, patronage, and scandal. Even voters who supported Reconstruction grew skeptical of the machinery enforcing it. Moral authority had been replaced by administrative drift. Economic pressures compounded this loss of trust. The Panic of 1873 plunged the country into a prolonged downturn. Unemployment, wage instability, and debt became immediate concerns for millions of Americans. Reconstruction, once framed as a moral obligation, increasingly felt distant from daily hardship. Political attention shifted, and patience wore thin. Within the party, this created a strategic dilemma. Republicans could no longer rely on the righteousness of their cause to carry elections. They needed to defend a system that many voters had grown tired of supporting. Power felt less secure, and insecurity tends to sharpen responses to threat. Rutherford B. Hayes emerged as the party's answer to this problem. As governor of Ohio and a former Union officer, he offered respectability without excess. He had no direct ties to Grant's scandals and spoke cautiously about reconciliation with the South. His candidacy signaled adjustment, not confidence. Yet moderation came with trade-offs. Hayes inspired less enthusiasm than earlier Republican leaders. His appeal was stabilizing rather than energizing. The party entered the election united in purpose, but diminished in momentum, especially in contested regions where turnout and control mattered most. This vulnerability shaped how Republicans interpreted the election as it unfolded. A party uncertain of its mandate is less willing to risk losing power. When results became unclear, Republican officials did not view the dispute as a temporary inconvenience. They viewed it as a test of survival. That mindset would heavily influence their willingness to contest outcomes, defend certifications, and push legal authority to its limits. The election was close, but the party's sense of decline made it feel closer still. The election of 1876 centered on two men who, while not radically different in temperament, represented sharply different futures for the post-war United States. Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden became vessels for expectations and anxieties that neither fully controlled. Tilden entered the race with advantages Democrats had lacked since the war. As governor of New York, he had built a reputation as a reformer willing to confront corruption even within his own party. That reputation mattered. It allowed Democrats to argue that replacing Republicans did not mean abandoning order, only changing who enforced it. In the South, Tilden's appeal ran deeper than reform. His candidacy carried the promise of an end to Reconstruction without openly challenging the constitutional amendments that underpinned it. Many white Southerners did not need explicit guarantees. They understood that a Democratic administration would be far less willing to sustain federal intervention in their affairs. Hayes represented something more cautious. He spoke carefully about national unity and respect for law, signaling continuity rather than rupture. Reconstruction under Hayes would not be aggressively expanded, but neither would it be abruptly abandoned. His message was restraint aimed at voters who feared renewed instability more than they desired transformation. Neither candidate openly courted confrontation. Both understood how close the country remained to the memory of war. Yet their campaigns mobilized constituencies that interpreted the stakes very differently. For Democrats, victory suggested restoration and autonomy. For Republicans, defeat threatened the unraveling of the post-war settlement itself. These divergent meanings mattered most in the contested Southern states. Their elections were not decided purely by persuasion. They were shaped by who controlled registration polling and certification. Both parties entered Election Day expecting conflict. Allegations of fraud or suppression were not surprises. They were assumptions. The closeness of the race was therefore not accidental. It reflected a system already under strain where narrow margins and contested authority were the norm rather than the exception. Each side pursued advantage while assuming the other would do the same. When early returns suggested a Tilden victory, Democrats believed their long exclusion from power was ending. When Republicans challenged those returns, they did so not simply to defend a candidate, but to defend a political order they believed would not survive a Democratic presidency. The election was no longer just about who won. It was about what would remain afterward. The instability of the 1876 election was intensified by how elections were actually conducted in the United States at the time. There was no standardized national ballot, no uniform counting method, and no centralized reporting authority. Each state and often each county followed its own procedures. Under normal circumstances, this decentralization was tolerated. In a close election, it became dangerous. Information moved slowly and unevenly. Vote totals arrived by telegraph or courier, often incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Party officials assembled their own estimates from friendly sources, while newspapers published figures that reflected expectation as much as verification. Early declarations of victory were therefore not conclusions but claims. Voting itself created further uncertainty. Ballots were commonly printed and distributed by political parties rather than by the state. Voters frequently cast pre-printed tickets listing a full slate of candidates. For literate voters, this system functioned adequately. For illiterate voters, it created opportunities for confusion and manipulation that were well understood and routinely exploited. In several southern states, these vulnerabilities were not theoretical. Ballots designed by one party were intentionally made to resemble those of the other. Polling places were poorly supervised. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Disputes over eligibility and counting were therefore expected regardless of how voters actually intended to cast their ballots. Crucially, authority over these disputes rested with state governments. In states still controlled by Republican administrations under Reconstruction officials possessed both the legal tools and the political incentive to challenge Democratic returns. In states where Democrats dominated local institutions, Republicans assumed the same would occur in reverse. Neutrality was not presumed, it was absent. As Election Day passed, it became clear that the presidency depended on outcomes in only a handful of states. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina each reported conflicting results with both parties claiming victory. In each case, the margins were narrow enough that disqualifying or validating relatively small numbers of votes could determine the presidency. This was the moment when uncertainty hardened into crisis. The system offered no trusted mechanism to reconcile competing claims. What might have been resolved quietly in a landslide election now became a national standoff. Each side insisted it was defending democracy. Neither believed the other. The absence of electoral infrastructure did not create fraud or intimidation, but it allowed suspicion to flourish unchecked. The election was no longer about counting votes. It was about who had the authority to decide what those votes meant. In a country still defining the boundaries of power after civil war, that question carried extraordinary weight. The national crisis of 1876 ultimately narrowed to 3 southern states, where the results strained credibility as much as they strained agreement. Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina each produced outcomes so contested that the question was no longer who had received more votes, but who possessed the authority to decide which votes counted. In Florida and Louisiana, violence and intimidation were widely acknowledged features of the campaign. Armed groups disrupted polling places, threatened voters, and interfered with ballot collection. These facts were not seriously disputed. What remained disputed was how such conditions should be weighed. Republicans argued that intimidation invalidated Democratic victories. Democrats countered that these claims were selectively enforced to justify overturning the results. South Carolina presented a different problem, but one no less damaging. The reported turnout exceeded the number of eligible voters. The figures suggested fraud on a large scale, yet they did not clearly identify a single culprit. In a state where federal oversight was resented and political control was fragile, the numbers themselves became a form of accusation. Republican-controlled state governments acted decisively. They convened boards with the authority to review returns and discard ballots deemed invalid. These decisions were formally legal and procedurally defensible. They were also predictably partisan. In every case, the invalidated votes disproportionately favored Democrats. From the Republican perspective, this was a defensive response. Allowing disputed returns to stand would, in their view, reward intimidation and signal the collapse of Reconstruction. Certification became a mechanism for preserving a system they believed was already slipping away. Democrats interpreted the same actions very differently. To them, the state boards were instruments designed to manufacture a result that voters had not delivered. The speed with which Hayes's apparent deficit became a narrow lead made the process feel engineered rather than adjudicated. Legality did not translate into legitimacy. As these reversals became public resentment spread beyond party leaders. Newspapers framed the dispute as evidence of corruption rather than confusion. Hayes acquired a reputation he would never fully escape, while Republicans portrayed themselves as preventing chaos rather than creating it. The crisis deepened because each side could point to facts that supported its narrative. Violence had occurred. Fraud had occurred. What the system lacked was a shared method for weighing those realities against one another. Authority rested with institutions already viewed as partisan. By the time the disputed states submitted their returns, the election had been transformed. Hayes now appeared to hold a narrow lead contingent on accepting Republican certified results. Tilden's earlier victory no longer existed as a settled fact. It survived only as a contested interpretation, and the country was running out of ways to reconcile the difference. Under ordinary conditions, certification was meant to confirm an outcome already understood. In 1876, it became the decisive act itself. With vote counts disputed and margins razor-thin, the authority to certify results effectively determined who would become president. Republican officials in the contested states defended their actions as both lawful and necessary. State law empowered them to judge the validity of returns, particularly when fraud or intimidation was alleged. From their perspective, refusing to act would have meant surrendering control of the process to forces they believed were actively undermining Reconstruction. Democrats rejected this logic outright. They argued that certification was being used not to clarify the result, but to replace it. What was presented as procedure they claimed functioned as partisanship by another name. The fact that Republicans benefited directly from their own decisions made any claim of neutrality difficult to accept. This conflict revealed a deeper structural weakness. The American electoral system assumed that those empowered to certify results would be trusted to do so in good faith. In 1876, that trust had collapsed. Certification no longer resolved disputes. It intensified them. Competing sets of electoral votes were prepared and sent to Washington. In some cases, rival slates claimed to represent the same state, each backed by its own legal rationale. The Constitution offered no clear guidance for choosing between them. What had once been a formality now posed an existential question. Normally, the vice president acting as president of the Senate would preside over the counting of electoral votes. In 1876, that option was unavailable. The vice president had died, and his successor in Senate leadership was a Republican whose involvement Democrats would not accept as impartial. The process required a decision no one trusted anyone to make. Democrats turned to the House of Representatives, where they held a majority arguing that Congress possessed ultimate authority under the 12th Amendment. Republicans countered that allowing one chamber to decide would nullify the electoral process entirely. Both sides cited constitutional language. Neither interpretation commanded consensus. As the dispute moved to Washington, the stakes rose sharply. The election was no longer about disputed ballots in distant states. It was about who controlled constitutional authority when the system failed. At that point, the fear was no longer delay or embarrassment. It was breakdown. By early 1877, the United States faced a problem its constitutional design had never fully confronted. The rules explained how presidents were elected, but not how to proceed when that process produced incompatible outcomes. There was no referee empowered to make a final call, and no agreed rulebook for a crisis of this kind. Each branch of government possessed partial authority and total suspicion. The Senate, controlled by Republicans, leaned toward Hayes. The House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats, favored Tilden. The presidency itself was held by a Republican administration whose legitimacy Democrats increasingly questioned. Any unilateral action risked being interpreted not as resolution, but as seizure. The language used by political leaders reflected this danger. Democrats spoke openly about blocking Hayes's inauguration. Republicans warned that refusing to seat the certified president would amount to rebellion. What had begun as legal disagreement now sounded uncomfortably like preparation for defiance. Beyond Congress, these tensions translated into concrete planning. Political clubs, veterans organizations, and state officials quietly assessed how they might respond if the crisis escalated. Memories of 1861 shaped these discussions. People understood how quickly constitutional disputes could give way to force. President Grant took these signals seriously. Although his term was ending, he remained responsible for maintaining order during the transition. He authorized federal troops to be positioned in and around Washington, D.C. The move was framed as precautionary, but its meaning was unmistakable. The federal government was prepared to enforce continuity if institutions failed to produce it. The inauguration itself became a security concern. Rumors circulated that both candidates might attempt to take the oath of office. Such a spectacle would have shattered any remaining sense of unity. To reduce the risk, Hayes's swearing in was quietly moved forward and conducted privately away from public confrontation. These measures revealed how close the system was to collapse. When power transfers require secrecy and soldiers' stability is no longer assumed, it is actively defended. The crisis had moved beyond ballots and briefs. It now hovered at the boundary between law and force, yet restraint still held. Despite the rhetoric and preparations, no one crossed the final line. Governors discussed militias but issued no orders. Veterans gathered and spoke but did not march. The country remained suspended in an uneasy balance, aware that the absence of a referee did not automatically produce violence, but that it made violence possible. As the stalemate deepened, Democrats searched for a way to alter the balance without openly rejecting the electoral system itself. Their most aggressive maneuver did not come from the contested southern states, but from Oregon, a state whose overall vote clearly favored Hayes. The move was legally arguable, politically explosive, and deliberately narrow. Oregon was entitled to 3 electoral votes. 2 Republican electors were uncontested. The third, however, held a federal post which Democrats argued made him constitutionally ineligible to serve as an elector. Acting on this interpretation, the Democratic governor of Oregon replaced the Republican elector with a Democrat who then cast his vote for Tilden. Technically, the argument was not frivolous. The Constitution barred federal office holders from serving as electors, and Democrats insisted they were simply enforcing a neglected rule. But intent mattered as much as legality. By flipping a single vote, Tilden could offset Republican gains elsewhere and restore his path to the presidency. Republicans rejected the substitution immediately. They denied the governor's authority to make such a change and dismissed the revised vote as an abuse of technicalities. To them, Oregon proved that Democrats were willing to manipulate procedural gray areas just as aggressively as Republicans were accused of doing in the South. This moment altered the character of the crisis. Until then, much of the dispute could be framed as fallout from violence and disorder in Reconstruction states. Oregon stripped away that context. It demonstrated that escalation was no longer confined to regions with unstable elections. It was now national, deliberate, and strategic. Public reaction reflected this shift. Talk of civil war intensified, no longer limited to partisan rhetoric. Newspapers warned of the Mexicanization of American politics, a fear that disputed elections would become routine and that power would be settled by force rather than acceptance. The concern was not simply who would win this election, but what kind of system would survive it. Behind the scenes, preparations continued. Grant's troop deployments remained in place. Governors sympathetic to Tilden renewed private discussions about mobilizing state militias if necessary. Even former Union and Confederate officers communicated quietly, gauging where loyalties might fall if institutions failed. At the same time, Oregon clarified something uncomfortable for both sides. Neither could impose a resolution without risking consequences they could not control. Every maneuver narrowed the remaining space for compromise. The crisis was approaching a point where the system would either invent a solution or collapse under the weight of its own ambiguity. By the winter of 1876 or 1877, the dispute had moved decisively beyond paper arguments. The language of legality remained, but beneath it lay preparation. The possibility of violence was no longer abstract. It was being anticipated quietly and methodically by people who understood how quickly political crises could harden into conflict. President Grant's decision to position federal troops around Washington was one of the clearest signals that the situation had crossed a threshold. Officially, the deployment was precautionary. In reality, it acknowledged that the transfer of power might not be accepted peacefully. The capital itself had become a potential flashpoint. These preparations were mirrored elsewhere. Governors aligned with Tilden spoke privately about the readiness of state militias. No public mobilization orders were issued, but the conversations mattered. They suggested that influential figures were contemplating scenarios in which federal authority would be challenged, not merely protested. What made this moment especially dangerous was the absence of clear sides in a familiar sense. The old lines of Union and Confederacy no longer applied cleanly. Former Union generals appeared among Tilden's supporters, while Republicans counted on veterans who had once fought to preserve the Union. Loyalty followed party, an interpretation of legitimacy, not geography. Rumors of rival inaugurations circulated widely. Some of Tilden's allies considered staging a separate swearing-in ceremony, possibly in New York. The symbolism would have been unmistakable: 2 presidents, 2 oaths, 2 claims to authority. It was precisely the scenario Americans feared most because it offered no peaceful way to resolve the contradiction. Public anxiety reflected these developments. Newspapers speculated openly about armed clashes and mass unrest. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had lived through the Civil War, recognized familiar warning signs. Political disagreement had not yet turned violent, but the infrastructure for violence was being quietly assembled. And yet restraint still held. Despite planning and rhetoric, no militias marched. No rival inauguration was announced. Preparations remained conditional, dependent on what Congress would decide. This hesitation was not accidental. Leaders on both sides understood that once force was used, it would be impossible to confine its consequences. This moment captured how close the country had come. The means were available. The justifications were prepared. What remained undecided was whether anyone would accept responsibility for crossing the line. In that hesitation lay the difference between crisis and catastrophe. With the risk of violence becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, Congress turned to a solution that reflected desperation rather than confidence. If the Constitution offered no clear answer, lawmakers would have to create one. The result was the establishment of a special electoral commission, an improvised mechanism designed to contain a crisis that existing institutions could not resolve. The commission was constructed to project balance. It would consist of 15 members, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent figure who would serve as the deciding vote. Its members were drawn from the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, creating the appearance of neutrality across branches of government. The structure was not elegant, but it was deliberate. Both parties agreed in advance to accept the Commission's decision as final. This agreement mattered more than the Commission itself. Without it, the body would simply become another arena for confrontation. The promise to abide by its ruling was a collective admission that no side could afford to keep pushing without risking collapse. The choice of the independent member initially seemed to validate this approach. Justice David Davis of the Supreme Court was widely respected as a man of integrity, known for independence rather than partisanship. His presence gave the commission credibility it would otherwise have lacked. For a moment, the possibility of a resolution that felt legitimate reappeared. This fragile consensus revealed how close the system was to failure. Lawmakers who had spent months accusing one another of corruption now cooperated to prevent disaster. The commission was not a triumph of constitutional foresight. It was an acknowledgement that the system had reached the edge of its design limits. Public reaction reflected cautious relief. Talk of immediate confrontation softened as attention shifted back to procedure. The creation of the commission suggested that the crisis might end without force even if the solution felt artificial. Stability, however, provisional, regained a foothold. Yet the commission's legitimacy rested entirely on perception. If it appeared partisan or manipulated, it would accelerate the very conflict it was meant to prevent. The fate of the presidency, and perhaps of the peace itself, now depended on whether a hastily constructed institution could command enough trust to hold. The Commission's authority depended almost entirely on the belief that it contained at least one figure capable of standing outside party interest. That belief unraveled before the Commission could complete its work. Justice David Davis, the independent member on whom the entire structure relied, was elected to the United States Senate by the Illinois legislature. The offer placed Davis in an impossible position. Accepting the seat would inevitably cast doubt on his role as an impartial arbiter. Remaining on the commission after such an appointment would suggest that political reward had influenced judicial judgment. To his credit, Davis chose to resign from the commission rather than compromise his reputation. His departure, however honorable, stripped the commission of its central justification. There were no remaining Supreme Court justices who could plausibly be described as neutral. Davis was replaced by another justice, this time one whose political alignment was well understood. The balance of the commission shifted not dramatically, but decisively. From that point forward, the outcome became increasingly predictable. The commission reviewed each contested set of electoral returns in turn. In every case, decisions were made along strict party lines. Republican members voted to accept Republican-certified electors. Democratic members voted to reject them. Deliberation gave way to alignment. The process remained procedurally sound. Hearings were held, arguments were heard, votes were recorded, yet the substance of neutrality had vanished. What remained was a mechanism that formalized positions already taken rather than adjudicating between them. When the final tally was announced, Hayes was awarded all of the disputed electoral votes. The result gave him a margin of 185 to Tilden's 184, the narrowest possible victory. The number itself underscored how thin the line was between resolution and rupture. This outcome resolved the election without resolving the dispute. It produced an answer that could be enforced, not one that could be celebrated. The commission had done its job in the narrowest sense. Whether it had preserved legitimacy was another matter entirely. The declaration of Rutherford B. Hayes as president-elect did not bring closure so much as it brought an endpoint. The process had produced a result, but it had not produced conviction. For large portions of the country, the decision felt imposed rather than earned. Democrats in the House of Representatives made their rejection explicit. They passed resolutions declaring Samuel J. Tilden the rightful winner and labeling Hayes's presidency illegitimate. These measures had no practical effect, but they were not empty gestures. They signaled that acceptance of the outcome was procedural, not moral. Republicans understood this fragility as well. Hayes's victory rested on the narrowest possible margin and on a process few found satisfying. Governing as though he had received a clear mandate was never an option. The priority was continuity, not triumph. What mattered most was not whether the decision was popular, but whether it would be resisted. The agreement to accept the commission's ruling functioned less like reconciliation and more like a ceasefire. Each side preserved its narrative of injustice, but chose not to escalate it further. Public reaction reflected this uneasy balance. There was no celebration, only relief that the immediate danger had passed. The election had exposed how vulnerable the system could be when trust collapsed. Confidence in democratic procedures was not restored by the outcome. It was merely stabilized. This moment marked how close the country had come to catastrophe. The institutions had not resolved the crisis cleanly. They had contained it just long enough for exhaustion to set in. The difference between peace and conflict rested on whether political actors would accept an answer they believed to be wrong. By choosing restraint, they allowed the crisis to end without bloodshed. But restraint came at a cost. The resolution closed the immediate conflict while leaving deeper questions about legitimacy, authority, and enforcement unanswered. Those questions would shape what came next. Once the Commission had ruled, the future of the crisis depended less on institutions than on individual choice. The legal process had produced an answer, but it could not compel belief. What mattered now was how the two men at the center of the dispute would respond to the power they claimed or declined to claim. Samuel J. Tilden's reaction was notably restrained. He did not issue a public concession in the modern sense, but he also did not mobilize his supporters to challenge the outcome. Despite having won the popular vote and believing the presidency had been taken from him, Tilden avoided direct confrontation. His silence created space where escalation might otherwise have taken hold. That restraint was not inevitable. Tilden was personally wealthy and well-connected. His allies urged him to finance legal challenges and organizational resistance. He declined. Instead of pressing his claim aggressively, he appeared to wait as though time itself might resolve the dispute in his favor. It was a choice, and it carried consequences. Without leadership or funding from the candidate himself, Democratic resistance fragmented. Anger remained, but it lacked coordination. calls for action were not matched by plans. As days passed, the sense of urgency diminished. The window for decisive challenge quietly closed. Hayes, by contrast, acted with deliberate certainty. From the moment the commission ruled, he behaved as the incoming president. His private inauguration, conducted under heavy security, was less a celebration than a declaration of continuity. He projected inevitability rather than persuasion. This contrast mattered. Hayes's assertion signaled to Republicans that the crisis had ended and that discipline was required, not agitation. Tilden's restraint signaled to Democrats that escalation would not be led from the top. In a moment when ambiguity could have reignited conflict, asymmetry reduced risk. Neither man called for violence. Hayes relied on institutions and enforcement already in motion. Tilden relied on limits, whether moral, strategic, or personal. Together, these choices narrowed the range of possible outcomes. The near collapse of 1876 did not end because the dispute was resolved. It ended because the men most capable of inflaming it chose not to test how far the country could be pushed. By the time Hayes's presidency became a practical reality, the conditions for open confrontation had quietly dissolved. The forces that might have driven the country toward another civil war still existed, but they no longer aligned in a way that made violence either likely or useful. What restrained them was not satisfaction with the outcome, but calculation shaped by memory. For many Democrats, particularly in the South, anger remained intense. The belief that the election had been taken through procedural maneuvering did not disappear with the commission's ruling. Yet anger alone was not enough to justify rebellion. The Civil War had left a clear lesson. Challenging federal authority once it committed to force was ruinous, not redemptive. There was also no unified leadership prepared to assume responsibility for escalation. Governors discussed militias. Party leaders spoke of resistance, and veterans organizations assessed their readiness. But no single figure coordinated these impulses into action. Without direction, preparation stalled. The cost of acting without consensus appeared greater than the cost of restraint. Northern Democrats faced an even colder calculation. Many believed the Republican hold on power was already weakening. Hayes's legitimacy was fragile, his margin razor-thin, and his party divided. From this perspective, time offered a safer path back to power than confrontation. Waiting did not feel like surrender. It felt strategic. Republicans, too, recognized the danger of pressing their advantage too far. They held the presidency, but not moral clarity. Using force to silence dissent would have confirmed Democratic accusations and risked unifying opposition across regions. Restraint served their interests as much as it served peace. Underlying all of these decisions was a shared cultural memory. The Civil War had stripped violence of any romantic appeal. It was remembered as catastrophic, uncontrollable, and transformative in ways no one wished to repeat. That memory did not eliminate division, but it raised the threshold for action beyond rhetoric. The absence of violence in 1876 was therefore not accidental. It was the product of hesitation informed by experience. The country did not step back from the brink because it trusted the outcome. It stepped back because it understood with painful clarity what stepping forward would cost. The crisis of 1876 ended without bloodshed, but it did not end without consequence. What followed was not a formal settlement or a celebrated compromise, but a gradual narrowing of federal ambition. Reconstruction did not collapse in a single moment. It was allowed to fade. In the years that followed the election, a narrative took hold that the crisis had been resolved through a secret bargain. According to this account, Democrats accepted Hayes as president in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops and the effective end of Reconstruction. The story captured a broader truth about what happened, but not how it happened. There is no evidence of a written agreement or a single decisive meeting where terms were exchanged. What existed instead was convergence. Hayes had long believed that Reconstruction, as enforced by military presence, could not be sustained indefinitely. His views were not concessions extracted during the crisis. They were consistent with his political instincts. Democrats, for their part, did not suddenly become cooperative. The House of Representatives continued to challenge Hayes's legitimacy, passing resolutions that declared Tilden the rightful winner. If a grand bargain had existed, this persistent opposition would have made little sense. Acceptance of Hayes was conditional, not reconciled. Nevertheless, Federal troops were withdrawn from the remaining occupied southern states. Republican governments there collapsed with remarkable speed. Democratic control returned, and with it came the rapid dismantling of protections for black political participation. The federal government's willingness to intervene declined sharply. This outcome reflected the priorities revealed by the crisis. Stability had taken precedence over enforcement. Avoiding renewed civil war mattered more in the immediate term than sustaining a political order that depended on force. Reconstruction had survived the election, but it did not survive the peace. For many Americans, particularly black citizens in the South, the cost of this decision was devastating. Rights that had existed in law lost what limited protection they had enjoyed in practice. The election of 1876 did not simply determine a presidency. It marked a turning point in the federal government's commitment to the post-war settlement. The quiet end of Reconstruction underscored the nature of the crisis itself. The country stepped back from the edge of civil war, but it did so by narrowing its vision of justice. Peace was preserved. The promise of equality was not. In the months after the election, Americans were left with an uneasy recognition. The constitutional system had survived its most severe test since the Civil War, but it had not done so through clarity or confidence. It had endured because the people operating it remembered what failure looked like. That memory shaped behavior in subtle but decisive ways. Politicians who spoke fiercely in public acted cautiously in private. Veterans who discussed mobilization understood better than anyone what mobilization meant. The abstract language of honor, legality, and legitimacy lost much of its power when weighed against lived experience. This collective memory functioned as an informal restraint. It did not resolve disagreement or restore trust. It simply limited how far disagreement could go. When leaders considered escalation, they did so with an awareness that civil war was not a theoretical outcome. It was a known one with consequences no speech or justification could contain. The election of 1876 exposed how heavily American democracy relied on norms rather than enforcement. The Constitution assumed good faith where none was guaranteed. It expected losers to concede and winners to govern with restraint. When those assumptions were strained, the system depended on human judgment more than written rules. In this sense, the crisis was managed rather than solved. The weaknesses it revealed were not repaired. There was still no clear process for contested elections. Reconstruction collapsed without replacement. Hayes governed under a cloud of disputed legitimacy. Yet the absence of immediate violence allowed the country to continue functioning. Stability came to be understood as fragile, but valuable, something that required compromise even when compromise felt wrong. The lesson of 1876 was not that democracy always produced fair outcomes, but that it could survive unfair ones if enough people chose not to tear it apart. The cost of that choice was uneven. Some Americans benefited from restored order and reconciliation. Others lost political power and protection they had only briefly possessed. The peace that followed was real, but it was not neutral. What held the country together was not resolution, but restraint informed by memory. The nation remained divided, but it remained one nation. That distinction mattered more than anyone was comfortable admitting. Measured only by what ultimately happened, the election of 1876 can appear deceptively calm. There was no armed clash in Washington, no rival governments sustained in parallel, no formal rupture of the Union. Power transferred, however, awkwardly, and the country moved on. But that surface outcome obscures how narrow the margin truly was. At multiple points, the system ceased to function as designed. Electoral returns were incompatible. Certification became partisan. Constitutional authority fragmented across institutions that did not trust one another. Troops were deployed, militias discussed, and contingency plans quietly prepared. None of this belonged to a stable democracy operating within normal bounds. What prevented another civil war was not the strength of the process, but the reluctance of individuals to push it beyond recovery. A more confrontational response from Tilden, a less cautious posture from Grant, or a single misjudgment by state leaders could have tipped the balance. The absence of violence was not guaranteed, it was chosen. The crisis revealed that the distance between constitutional order and armed conflict can be measured in decisions rather than ideals. When legitimacy fractures and procedures fail, force becomes a plausible substitute. In 1876, the United States reached that threshold and paused. The country did not step back because the election felt just. It stepped back because those with the power to escalate understood what escalation meant. Civil war was not an abstraction. It was a recent memory and one that carried weight precisely because it had been lived. By the time the crisis ended, the answer to how close the nation came no longer required emphasis. The preparations had been made. The arguments had been exhausted. The system had been stretched to its limit and held together only by restraint. That restraint preserved peace, but it also exposed how fragile that peace was. The election of 1876 did not prove that American democracy was unbreakable. It showed how close it could come to breaking and how much depended on the willingness of its leaders to stop before the break became permanent.